Let's talk brushes in Photoshop. Now, brushes are an absolutely amazingly wide and deep portion of Photoshop, but it is also just truly awesome with what you can do with these brushes, the number of preset brushes that they have, all the different parameters that you can dial in, all the different effects. But in order to be able to access all of these and understand, we have to run through the basics of brushes. Now, the basics of brushes is still an awful lot to know and understand. So, in order to get a better idea of brushes, we're going to jump into our toolbar and we're going to go over to our brush tool. And there's 4 different tools that are nested with a brush tool: the brush, pencil, color replacement, and mixer brush tools. We're going to focus on the brush tool. The pencil tool is kind of like the brush tool, just much more basic. The color replacement tool is a kind of like a retouching tool where you can go in and actually touch things and replace the color of. And the mixer brush tool is for the artists out there who like to do watercolor and actual mixing of pigments. But we're sticking with just the brush tool. Now, when you're starting off with a brush tool, make sure that the brush is, your cursor actually looks like your brush. And what do I mean by that? Well, if you have your caps lock key on, you're going to get just this little set of crosshairs here, and I'll zoom in so you can see. Okay, we want to be able to see our actual brush. Now, you may go in and you may be working with a brush that is not just a round brush, and the way I call up my brush panel, one of many different ways you can, is just right click directly on your document with your brush tool. So if I start off here and I choose some type of brush, the brush will go ahead and look like whatever it is that I've chosen from my brush panel. So it may not be a round brush, but we're going to start off with our round, basic, soft, round brush. Now, I enjoy right-clicking directly on my document because that's where I am at the time. Going up to the upper left-hand corner of my screen with my options bar, I can do the same thing. Next to the little brush icon and that number, by the way, that number isn't a 112 brush. This is the size in pixels of that particular brush. And you can change the size of this, funny enough, by clicking in the drop-down menu and changing the size. You'll notice that that is definitely the size of the pixel. Now, because I have a basic brush, we're going to talk all about the basic brushes and then all the other cool stuff we see here, I can control how hard and how soft this brush is, and we're going to talk all about hardness and softness. So you can see this icon here, as I make the brush harder, is going to appear much more clean. If I do it softer, you're going to have a softer, more feathered edge around it, and that's if I would like to paint with a very soft brush or a very hard brush. Now, don't get confused that this is a soft round brush and I've just made that brush hard and this is a hard brush. We can take any of these brushes and we can change the attributes. Okay, this is all basically the same brush with different attributes, and then they're saved in here with those particular attributes. But that doesn't mean we can't just grab a brush and change these attributes. Okay, it's a great place to start when we have a saved brush like this, and then we can change those attributes. But going up to the drop-down menu in the upper left-hand corner of the screen each and every time just takes too much time. Right-click, you're going to get the same menu. You choose these items, hit return, and that will disappear. Let's run through some of the basic options that we have so we get a better understanding about how these brushes work. So back up to the options bar. Next to our brush drop-down menu is this little folder. And this is our brush settings. And our brush settings allow us to go ahead and change just this huge range of items that will go ahead and make our brushes do all these crazy things. And I mean, it just, yeah, we're going to go through them. So just go ahead, get yourself buckled in here because it's going to be an awesome ride. Now you'll notice in the brush settings here, our preview of these brushes is slightly different because this is a smaller little window. This window that you see here is the exact same window when you right click and call up your brush. This just doesn't show you the full paint out of each brush. Now we're talking brushes, but brushes came around way back in like Photoshop 2.5 when the first soft brush actually was there. Ask me how I know. Before that, you just had hard brushes. It was like painting with a potato. And then in Photoshop 2.5, you could get a soft brush. Well, brushes back then were just this cursor, okay? And it acted like a brush because you could paint. But you see now in today's Photoshop, we literally have all these brushes, like bristle brushes. These pixel-based ones are still, they're all pixel-based, but these that are just actual, like images are part of the original brushes. So when I say brushes, don't think like, oh, okay, a bristle brush. We do have bristle brushes too. And we also have crayons and pencils and chalk and airbrush effects. But all of these are considered brushes here because these are all pixel based. So brushes is a very broad term and not just something that you think of as a bristle brush. Okay? And we're going to get through all of these brush settings. Next is the mode in which we paint. We're going to leave this on normal for now because blending modes are something in a totally different world. They're awesome, but I think it's going to get a little bit too much when painting. Opacity. How much do you want to control the opacity? Do you want solid color? Do you want less solid color to begin to overlay colors together? Of course, quick and easy way to adjust the opacity is just click on the word opacity, get the finger scrubby and scrub back and forth. An even faster way is just select your brush and hit a number on your keypad. If you'd like 70%, just hit the number 7. If you want 35, just type in 35. Of course, 0 gets you back to 100% opacity. If you are using a Wacom tablet or any type of stylus with pressure-sensitive pad here, this button here, when it's depressed here, and it's gray, that actually means that it's on, this will allow you to go ahead and the pressure of your pen on the tablet will control the opacity. So the more you push and the less you push, that's going to control the opacity. Since I'm using the mouse, I'm not going to have that on because there is no pressure sensitivity with the mouse. Next is the flow. And the flow is going to be based on my airbrush setting here. And this says enable airbrush style effects, okay? And we can turn a normal brush and then we can take that and apply an airbrush style effect. Now we also have airbrush brushes too, which is something kind of different. The airbrush effect has been around far longer than the actual airbrush brushes, but it's kind of a cool thing. With this, we can control the flow rate at which the color comes out of the airbrush. Just like you would be able to go in and spray with an airbrush, you hook it up to an air supply, you're spraying with the ink or the pigment, and you can control how fast or how slow it comes out. Some people think that flow adjusts opacity. It appears that way, but that really isn't what it is. Smoothing allows me to go in and set the smoothness of my brush stroke. When I'm using the mouse, and you'll see this, you may get a little bit jumpy when you're going and painting with your brush using the mouse. The smoothing, the higher the number, will go ahead and give you a smoother rate at which it goes down, so you don't get little bumps and jumps in the whole thing. We can paint with an angle, so if we have a brush that isn't a circle, because you wouldn't be able to see the angle with a circle, if it was a brush that was at an angle, we could control that angle there. Here is also the pressure sensitivity to go ahead and adjust these items here using pressure sensitivity as well. Another feature is the symmetry feature. Oh yes, you can paint with symmetry. We're going to show you that. But these are the things that are here available in the brush options bar. So let's start off here. When I right click, I'm going to call up my entire list of brushes. Now your list of brushes may be different because from time to time Photoshop has been changing the way the brushes work. In the last couple versions of Photoshop, they've added a lot of cool new brushes. I have tons of brushes in here, and the reason why is because when I call up my brush panel, I click on the gear and I load my legacy brushes. And legacy brushes are a lot of these brushes that were from older versions of Photoshop. So if you click on that and say, okay, load those legacy brushes, click OK, which I've already done a couple times. And the legacy brushes will then come in, and I've got all my legacy brushes here. And here I've got default, assorted brush, on and on and on. So there's tons of brushes in here. So if you're not seeing what I'm seeing there, you can load those in and get those. We can also create brushes as well. You can also purchase or get brushes, and you can import the brushes in here. You can also get more brushes here, and Photoshop has tons of brushes. I mean, there's just so much stuff you can do. So don't feel that the brush panel is just like, oh, I don't see much, I'm not going to get very much. No, lots of options that you have here, folks. Click Return to get rid of the brush menu. Now I just want to talk about basic size and hardness of the brush. Now, it's hard to see when I right-click what size and hardness my brush is, okay? So I don't like this to slide these back and forth because this shows me nothing. Does anybody know what a 182 pixel brush looks like? Nah. How hard or how soft? No, that doesn't work. Now, if you do go up to your options bar here, the one little trick that you can see is if you pay attention to this preview here, you can change the hardness and the softness of the brush. But you know what, that's pretty small. That's a pretty obscure thing because you wouldn't know that that has a hardness of 0, which we commonly refer to a soft brush, or a hardness of 100, okay? You wouldn't look at that and be like, oh yeah, I can tell that that's a 50% brush. No, you wouldn't. Hardness is indicated by this, but size isn't. So let's talk about just some quick shortcuts. Right bracket is going to make your brush larger, okay? Left bracket is going to make your brush smaller, plain and simple, okay? So that works pretty nicely. Now, in order to actually see what your brush looks like on the screen, I'd like to see I see this round, but I can't tell if this is a soft or a hard brush just by looking at the brush here. Now, I would like to see the attributes of this brush before I begin painting. And it's hard to see how hard or how soft this brush is just by looking at the cursor. I can see how big it is, but I want to see the actual attributes. I'm going to zoom in here, and I want you to hold down your Option and Control or your Alt and Control key and click on your document. You'll see it gives you a little hint that says here's the diameter, here's how hard, and here's how soft. Diameter is controlled by moving your mouse or cursor left to right. Hardness is controlled by moving your cursor up or down, okay? So there it is, up and down will control how hard or how soft to do that. It's super nice because when you're working and you want to have a very specific look to your brush, you want to see what that looks like before you begin to paint. Now my shortcuts that I like to use are going to be keyboard shortcuts. And so left bracket is going to make my brush smaller. Right bracket is going to make my brush larger. Shift right bracket or shift left bracket is going to increase or decrease the hardness. So if I do shift left bracket, that's going to decrease the hardness in 25% increments. So it looks like the brush actually got a little bit smaller. It didn't. It's actually the same brush. It's just got a hardness of 0. So if I do the shift right bracket again, that's going to be a hardness of 25%. Shift right bracket again, hardness of 50%. Shift right bracket again, hardness of 75%. And shift right bracket, hardness of 100%. So 0, 25, 50, 75, 100% hardness. So it does look like it changes the size, but the cursor is actually the same size on every one. Obviously, it gives you a nice soft edge. Now, as I go through and I begin to paint on this, I'm going to need more room. So I'm doing this little trick, and I'm actually getting rid of all my content by going in, and it looks like I've just erased everything completely. I actually didn't. Over here in my toolbar, I have my color, which I'm painting with, which is my foreground color, and then my background color is white. And I'm using Command Delete or Control Delete just to fill my layer with white, so it looks like all my content's going away. Okay, I'm not actually erasing it, I'm just filling it with a new color. If I do Option or Alt Delete, it's going to fill it with a foreground color. Command or Control Delete is going to fill it with a background color. So as we go through this tutorial, if you see these things disappearing and you're like, how did you erase that? I really didn't. I just filled it with another color. So let's show you how these brushes can actually work for you. If I start off here with my brush, and I've got a hard brush, I can just simply paint. You can just right click and choose whatever brush you want, and then come in here and I can paint. Now there's interesting attributes with this when you have a hard or soft brush. You'll notice when I paint with a hard brush, I kind of get this caterpillar effect, okay? This little dot, dot, dot. And that's happening because the brush is really coming in here and just repeating itself like this as we paint. Now you'll also notice that this line isn't completely smooth. Well, this is where the smoothing option can come in. If I set the smoothing to 100 and I begin to paint, you'll notice I get this little tracer line, and it tends to give me a really straight line here, but it doesn't take care of that little caterpilling effect. And we're going to fix that little bumpy effect right there. I'm going to fill this again with white using my Command Delete. Once I soften that brush by going in and holding down my Option Control and start to soften that brush, change the hardness, you'll notice when I paint now I don't get that caterpilling effect because it's kind of blending itself together. But we will fix that little choppy blending effect right there. Now I can choose any color by going to my color picker, just grabbing a color, changing the size of my cursor, my brush. Left bracket's going to make it smaller, right bracket's going to make it bigger, and I can paint. When you have this smoothing turned up, it's going to paint slower because it's trying to go ahead and match your movements in a smooth fashion. If you turn smoothing down or to 0 here, you'll notice that you paint much quicker. So if speed is what you want, go in and turn the smoothing off. If smoothness is what you want, crank it up, but you'll also have to have a little more patience. As I'm painting, again, I can paint with any of my colors that I choose, and you'll notice that these colors don't blend together. And the reason why is because my opacity here is set to 100%, so I'm painting with full opacity. I can go up to opacity and crank that down, but I like my shortcuts, so I'd like to paint with my brush at 50%. So with my brush active, I'm simply going to type in the number 5 on my keyboard, and it immediately goes to 50%. Okay, I don't have to touch anything other than my keyboard and just type in whatever number, and so if I type in 4, it's 40%. Now, when I'm painting with this color at 40%, you'll notice that when I paint, I'm getting transparency. And as I go over the other colors, you can see this effect. I can kind of overpaint with my brushes, and any color that you want. Pick and choose, you've got your entire spectrum here, but just remember that when you're painting with opacity, you're going to kind of get this overlay of colors. 0 is going to bring you back to 100% opacity, and then you won't be able to see through that color. I'm going to do my Command Delete again to fill it with my background color of white. Now let's talk about flow. Well, flow is going to work when we have our airbrush enabled, our airbrush effect. Click the airbrush tool, and we're going to keep the flow at 100%. And what does this mean? Well, I'm going to make a larger cursor here, but I'm also going to soften the cursor so I have a very soft cursor. This particular method of using the airbrush effect does not work on a brush with 100% hardness. You have to have some softness to the brush in order for this to work. Let me pick a more saturated color here so we can see this a little bit better. With the airbrush effect turned on, I can simply click and hold, and the longer I hold, the more the color builds. If I turn off the airbrush effect and I click and hold, I get one hit of color and nothing else. The flow rate is going to be pertinent to my airbrush effect. If I cut down the flow rate here, and I'm going to just do a smaller cursor because I'm going to run out of room quickly. If I hold this in one place, you can see it will build the color, but if I move it around, it doesn't give me much color. And the reason why is because my flow rate, the rate in which the color is coming out, is much slower. People think that this is opacity. Well, it kind of is, only because you're not spraying that much ink or that much color when you're doing this, so it's just coming out at a very, very, very low rate. Okay? So it is giving you the effect of opacity, but that's not really what it is. Because once you turn off the airbrush effect right here and you want to use this, this could be really annoying, okay? Because if you go in and you turn down the flow rate, all of a sudden it's like, see, I'm affecting opacity. No, you're just affecting the strength, which is different than opacity. It's just not coming out as fast. So I recommend not using flow unless you are using the airbrush effect and you truly want it to come out slower. Okay. Now, going in and being able to paint in a straight line. You can paint in a straight line here. Let me get a more saturated color so we can see this a lot better. And I'm going to make this a hard brush by using my Shift right bracket and making a hard brush. I can paint in a straight line as best I can. I can turn on my smoothing, which is definitely going to help that. And turn it on by cranking it up to 100 there. There we go. You can see I can get a straighter line that way. Now, if I do hold down my Shift key when I begin, if I hold down my Shift key, that's going to allow me to get a perfectly horizontal or a perfectly vertical line. I can't go any other direction. See that? Try to go over there. If I introduce Shift before I begin to paint. But what I'd like to do here is I would like to show you what we can do with painting when you don't want to go in a horizontal or vertical line. So what I'm going to do is click, and then I'm going to hold down my Shift key after I've clicked once, let go of my mouse, hold down Shift, and click again. Now keeping my Shift key held down, Shift, click, 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 all with my Shift key held down, this will allow me to paint in straight lines. Well, this is super nice. Okay, straight lines not meaning horizontal or vertical, but basically connecting the dots, like we did when we were kids with those little coloring books. Okay, so I click, hold down my Shift key, keep my Shift key held down, and every place that I click will go and connect to where I had before. Now, let's take care of this little caterpilling effect. Okay, this little caterpillar, this little dot, 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 dot that I get here, is because our spacing is off. Up in our toolbar, or options bar here, we're going to click on this little brush folder here, which is our brush settings folder. And our brush settings are going to show us exactly how this brush is going to work. On the very first item here in the brush settings folder is the brush tip shape. We have our spacing. Now again, this spacing you can set to be wider or narrower to get this cool effect, okay? To be able to go in here and space this all out. Well, this is set to about 25% to begin with, and this is what it gives us, that little dot, dot, dot. Now, of course, when I have a softer brush there, and you can see any changes that you make to the brush, you're going to see this reflected here at the bottom of the brush settings. So we don't see the spacing issue with a soft brush, but we definitely see the spacing issue with a hard brush. So to control that, just cut the spacing down until that little caterpillar bumpy effect goes away. Just like that. Nice, huh? We're going to get back to brush settings because there's a lot that goes on in here. But before we do that, I want to show the Symmetry tool here. Symmetry was added a couple versions ago, and it's just cool. I don't know when I would ever use it, but let's show you anyway. So with Symmetry, we've got several different choices. I can click on Vertical Symmetry. It gives me a line that says, hey, is this the line? And you, by the way, you can move that. And when you decide that that's the line there, double click or hit return. And then when you begin to paint here, you're going to paint with Symmetry. Pretty awesome. Okay, touch the line, comes back and touches right there. Okay, that's awesome. And of course, you can come up here and you can also turn your Symmetry off, which will get rid of your little painting line. But you've got all these different cool things. Okay, the radial one, this is awesome. Do your radial, make sure you set your transformation, and then when you do this, you can see that you can paint in this cool radial effect. Of course, you can choose any color that you'd like, and then go in and add certain things to this, and you always paint in that radius. Yeah. So I'm going to do the mandala, and I'm going to do Symmetry of 8 with this. I love this. So here, I can go, and I'm going to turn the smoothing down to move it a little bit faster here. Here you can do all these super cool items. And of course, you could shift-click if you wanted to with this as well. And I'm going to bring that all together. Pick a different color, go in, add some interest in here, whatever that may be, have a little bit of fun, and you can just go to town. different size brush, different hardness, different softness as well. And of course, just create any type of creation you could possibly imagine there in total symmetry. I love it. So that's just the symmetry painting right there. Imagine just all the different things that you could do with that. Incredible. So I'm going to remove my symmetry, go back up to the butterfly there and turn the symmetry off. Now let's talk about the actual brush presets here, or the brush settings. Now the brush settings come up from that little folder there. You can also go under your window menu, and you can also bring up your brush settings under your window menu. The brush settings allow us to do some really cool things. I'm going to right click, and some of the cool things that are nested inside my legacy swatches here is this thing called maple leaves, and we also have scattered leaves and dune grass and all this other crazy cool stuff. And what this allows me to do is go in and paint with a brush like this, and you're like, oh my gosh, how is this happening? Well, it's happening because of all these brush settings here, and this turned out to be, just started off as a simple maple leaf that somebody scanned in, turned into a brush, and then applied all these cool characteristics and features to in the brush settings. So let's give this a try. I'm going to right click, go back to my soft round brush, and let's walk through the brush settings here. So in the brush settings, we have our brush tip shape. And our brush tip shape, if we start off with a basic round brush, we can control the size of this, we can control the spacing of this as well, so I don't need to paint in a totally straight line. And I can also control how flat, or kind of do like a chisel tip if I want to do some type of calligraphy. So I don't have to have this be a round brush, I can have it be a flat brush with spacing, however you want to do that. And there's the brush, okay? Now, of course, I control how hard or how soft that is, and this is always going to give me a preview. One thing you'll notice is that brushes are never in color, okay? You'll never see a colored brush in your brush settings. The color is always applied in the file by the user. So I can never capture a color brush. I can capture a brush, which we then apply color to, but never a color brush. Let's jump down to shape dynamics. And when you click on these, you can't just turn this on or off. You have to click and make sure it's turned on too. See, if I turn on scattering, it doesn't come up because I'm not actually on scattering. So you got to click the name and the checkbox. Shape dynamics allow me to do the size jitter. And a jitter basically means bouncing back and forth. So bouncing back and forth between small and large. And you set the extremes here. Now, because we're using a mouse, these control drop-down menus aren't going to do as much as I would like, simply because these are going to control pressure sensitivity and pen tilt when you're using a pressure-sensitive pen and a tablet. I'm not, so I can't use these particular features, but these control features control what they're associated with. In this case, this one is controlling the size jitter. If you were going to use pen pressure, you would control the jitter with the pressure of the pen. So right now I'm going to keep those off. Well, I can control the minimum diameter here, so I get large and small. I can also change the angle here, and I try that out here, and it's like, wow, okay, this is kind of crazy. I can do the roundness jitter, so I get a lot more flat and more round, and I can also do how flat and how round, and just change this. Now remember, this was just an original round brush just a minute ago. And this is what we can do with these brushes. Let's jump down to scattering. Scattering allows us to scatter it off the axis that we started with. Kind of like a slow-mo in the movies where you see that explosion. Boom. Like that. I can control how many, and I can also control the count jitter when I'm painting of how many I'm going to get here, and gives a very different effect. I can apply texture to this, and texture is literally applying a pattern or something here, and I do have my patterns panel, but I can use the presets here, but I can also create my own as well. So here I just have a piece of paper in, and I can kind of put that piece of paper in here. and I can scale it and put the contrast and the brightness and so on. And I'm not seeing much with this particular one here, but you're going to get different effects with different patterns and textures. I'm going to turn that off. Dual brush allows me to go and combine brushes together. So if I have some kind of interesting textured brush in this file here, I can grab this, but then I have different ways that they're going to blend together. Now, if you're not familiar with blend modes here, this may not make a lot of sense, but this is how they're going to blend together. So if I do this, I can see that I get a little bit different effect. And some of these may have a very profound effect. Some of these may not. And part of it is the saturation or the opacity of my brush right here. But you can put brushes together. I'm going to turn that off as well. Color dynamics. Color dynamics allow you to change this so you don't get a singular color when you're painting. I can go back and forth between my foreground and my background color, which is basically here in my toolbar. It's going to jump back and forth between my colors that I pick here. With that foreground-background jitter, now you can go in and get a different range of colors. So this is bouncing back and forth in between my green and my white. Of course, the more you ramp that up, the more difference you're going to get. The hue jitter is going to go ahead and change the hue more drastically. Saturation, of course, is going to saturate that more. We can ramp up the purity and get different looks. And all of a sudden here, we get this kind of, mixture of these colors, shapes, sizes, and randomness. Transfer button allows us to go ahead and do the opacity and the flow. Certain brushes will give us certain items here. This particular brush won't give us these particular items. The brush pose is going to be all about your stylus. So your tilt and rotation, all that stuff. Okay, but we don't have a brush, we don't have a stylus at this point. Noise, you'll notice that I don't get any options for this. Noise is going to give me a little bit of texture on the surface, a little bit of disturbance on the surface. It'll make it look kind of grainy. Wet edges will give me kind of a watercolor effect, where it will give me kind of that ring around the edge that I'm dealing with. So you can imagine all these cool things that you could do with any given brush. Now I'm going to go back up to my brush tip shape here at the very top. And if you wanted to go and figure out how these brushes in here work, you can always click on a brush and you can see what's going on with this brush. Okay, and you can click on that and say, hey, I'd like to go through and find out the dynamics of this brush. Now, in the brush settings panel here, we can go back and we can actually call up our brushes panel right here, okay, just by clicking on the brushes. But when we have our brush settings panel, you'll notice that when I choose a brush now, every brush that I choose is going to keep all of these same effects, okay? So this is kind of like an overlay. So it's not like we're just applying this setting to this one brush. We're applying this setting and I can grab any brush that I want and it's just going to give me all of those settings. So once I get that brush preset or that brush setting done, I can go up to my control bar here and say, I would like a new brush preset. And so I can say, here it is, here's my soft round brush, and I can include the color attributes in there because it will remember the brush color, it won't actually color the brush. And if I want to capture the brush size in there, I can, but I'm not going to. So now if I right click, any brush settings that I make, you can see it's going to go right in here. So there's my brush setting right there. So it's a soft round brush, but I've applied other stuff to it. I can always go back to my original brush here. And you'll notice when I go back to my original brush, all my brush settings are now have gone back to normal here. So brush settings are kind of an interesting thing, okay? We're not really creating a new brush. What we're doing is we're creating a brush setting with different styles, okay? So you can practice with this stuff all the time. And again, if I go back to my brush settings here and just go back to just an absolute normal setting right here, I'm going to right click and call up my brushes. Go back, you'll notice that my basic brush here, it turned all my settings off, okay? But if you want to figure out how certain things work, like how do the scattered maple leaves work, select the brush, hit return. you can see how that works. Go into your brush settings, and you can control each one of these things that's checked to find out what makes it tick. So it could be kind of cool. Now, one interesting thing with the brush is the eraser works the same way, folks. Okay? Let's talk about the eraser tool. And the eraser tool is essentially a brush, and a brush that just simply erases. So you'll notice that the eraser tool has the same settings that we have in the brush panel, other than the mode doesn't have a blend mode because we're not blending, we're erasing. And the mode just happens to be a brush mode, which means I can choose any brush from my brushes panel and I can erase. So if I do a soft round brush, I just come in with my eraser and I erase. Now, why isn't it erasing here? Well, first of all, I'm not on a layer. Okay, so when I erase, it's erasing to the background color here. Remember, in order to get rid of something, you have to be on a layer. So if I use my eraser tool, I can erase with a soft brush or a hard brush, going through and just simply erasing. But I can choose any brush in here. Would I like to go ahead and erase with an airbrush, hard density, high, grainy, delicious, yum yum? Sure. I grab that brush, and when I go in and erase, I can go in, and you can see that it will allow me to erase using that particular brush. So I'm not limited to just painting with brushes. I'm actually able to paint with the eraser tool. Well, remove with the eraser tool, but still the same concept. I'm just simply removing whatever I want, but just with a brush. Now remember, there's all these brushes that you can get in here and you can work with. We only covered just the very basic pixel-based brushes. And, so much to explore, but this was just a really quick overview of what you could do with the brushes. And then, of course, we threw the eraser in there because it is a brush. It just happens to take away. So give that a shot and see what you come up with.